Hi, I'm Pete and welcome to Just a Few Acres Farm. In this video I'm going to install an Iron Bull ROPS or rollover protection system and canopy on my International 656 tractor. Iron Bull is a company that makes ROPS and canopies located in Indiana, and they make these things for not only international tractors but John Deere, Ford, Oliver, etc. Lots of different makes. And the reason I chose Iron Bull is, number one, their canopies and ROPS look pretty darn close to factory original, and I was after that with this tractor. In fact, I can't even tell the difference. I've looked at a lot of photographs of original ROPS and canopies for internationals. Number two, they're made in America, and that's pretty important to me. And number three, they're certified, which I think means that a structural engineer looked at the design and made sure that it can resist the force and protect the operator if the tractor does roll over. Now, we don't farm on a lot of hilly terrain, but this tractor gets used mostly for making hay, and it gets really hot out there in an open cab tractor on sunny days when you're making hay. So the canopy cuts down on that heat a lot, and that's the reason I chose to install it. The first thing to do is to take off the old ROPS canopy and fenders. The ROPS were made by Lauren, a Canadian company, which I think has since gone out of business, and I made the canopy myself out of plywood and 2x4s. And it worked all right. The problem was, though, that the ROPS kept breaking mounting bolts on the axle. It only had 1 7/8 inch bolt on each end of the axle on each side, and sometimes when the tractor would hit a bump, I would break a bolt, which was pretty alarming to me because this thing was supposed to be certified to stop the tractor from rolling over all the way, and it couldn't even hold itself up half the time. So I never really had a lot of faith in it. The last time I broke a ROPS bolt, I was in the middle of baling hay and I didn't have time to go get another bolt, so I wound up welding the thing back together, and it held up pretty well. I was surprised. I got a notice in the mail that Iron Bull was having a sale and gave free shipping, so I decided to order one. I'd been looking at them for quite a while. I ordered the ROPS and canopy, and it showed up on a tractor trailer about a week later. The tractor trailer didn't have a lift gate. Now, everything seemed well packed. It was on an oversized pallet and all wrapped up and seemed undamaged. But we had a bit of a heck of a time getting it off the truck because there was no lift gate. I wound up having to position the bucket loader so that I could slide the package onto it and then hold up the bucket, hold it high, and then drive it up to the barn and place it in the barn. The ROPS came with everything needed to install it, including all the mounting hardware. The one thing that was lacking really was a good set of instructions. I got this one sheet, and even the sheet is for other models of international tractors besides mine. The 656 is not listed on here, and to say this is not a step-by-step set of instructions is an understatement. It's pretty vague. It's got some torque values on it. It's got lists of what bolts go where, kind of, but it doesn't say in order to assemble the thing or anything like that. And I suspect that's because most of the people that are putting these in know what they're doing, and they really don't need detailed instructions. But this was the first time I had installed this specific make of ROPS, even though I'd done ROPS before, so it took some head scratching for me to figure out some of the steps. The instructions indicated that the fenders should be installed on the ROPS after the ROPS was installed on the tractor. On this particular ROPS, it's got flanges on the sides of it to bolt the fenders to. Instead of the fenders bolting directly to the axle, they're mounted on the ROPS. And as I looked at the instructions and looked at the tractor, I thought, well, I should probably install the fenders on the ROPS before I put the ROPS on the tractor, because there isn't enough room to drill the holes in the fenders to mount them to the ROPS when the ROPS is on the tractor. So I went out of order, and the first thing I did was mount the fenders on the ROPS before putting the ROPS on the tractor. Before mounting the fenders, I had to take the bases off of the fenders, which are used to mount the fenders onto the axles. And the bolts that held the two parts together probably hadn't been removed in the 50 years since the tractor had been built. And they did not come out easy. Quite often I'll use a doubled wrench rather than a long breaker barn socket to loosen stubborn bolts. The wrench is less likely to turn off the bolt's head than a socket because I'm applying force in the plane of the bolt instead of above it. I could have used an impact wrench here, but for some strange reason I like wrenching bolts by hand. Once I had the fender bases off, I had to position the fenders and attach them to the ROPS. I positioned the loader bucket so I could lean the ROPS against it and get the ROPS at the same angle as it would be on the tractor. I figured if the ROPS plates were level, then the ROPS was about at the right tilt. I leveled it by the mounting plates for the fenders, but I probably should have leveled the base plates instead. And I scratched my head for a while about how to position the fenders correctly. In the end, I decided to temporarily attach the fender bases back onto the fender to get it at the right height. Then I aligned the fender base plate with the ROPS base plate. Because both mount on the axles, I figured this would put the fender in the correct position front to back. And then, since I had the ROPS leveled, I put a level on the fender. This finished positioning it, and now I could mark 2 holes to mount it in place while I held the fender. Then I drilled out the 2 holes, and I bolted the fender on and re-leveled it. There were 1/2 inch bolts and 9/16 inch holes, so there's room for a little adjustment back and forth to get everything leveled before tightening up the bolts. Now that the fender was held in place, I took the fender base back off and drilled the rest of the holes for the remaining mounting bolts. It's been about 2,000 degrees out, and unfortunately the air conditioning in the barn isn't working. I gotta fix that one of these days. I should have mounted the fender a few inches rearward of where I did, because 2 bolts on the lower plate landed right in the middle of the fender's reinforcing channel, wouldn't you know it. I was able to get the lower bolt in each one by pushing the nut up inside the channel with my fingers, and the other one I just left off. The fender's still plenty solid. It's got 7 bolts in it, and each bolt is a 1/2 inch diameter. Mounting the second fender was pretty much the same process as the first, except after I got the fender in place and leveled, I took a measuring tape and measured the first fender from the back of the mounting plate to the back of the fender and checked it on the second fender just to make sure they were in the same spot. Then I marked 2 holes and drilled the fender and mounted it on the ROPS. Before tightening up the bolts, I sighted along the top of both fenders to make sure they were in alignment. And after that, it was just a matter of drilling out the rest of the holes and putting the bolts in and tightening them up. Now that I had the ROPS and the fenders ready to go, I had to figure out whether I wanted to mount the canopy on the ROPS before I put it on the tractor or after I put it on the tractor. And this was made more complicated by the fact that I don't have a forklift, so it was pretty hard to lift that big canopy up to get it in proper alignment with the ROPS when it's on the tractor. And also, there's some awful nice paint on this thing, and I didn't want to ruin it by having to shove it around on the top of a loader and spend a lot of time positioning it. Unlike my old wood canopy, this canopy was heavy. I couldn't lift it up there by hand like I could the wood one. While I had it up and I was seeing how heavy it was, I also noticed that the delivery truck driver scratched the paint on the top of the canopy when he slid his pallet jack under it. The marks were unmistakable. In the end, I decided to mount the ROPS on the tractor without the canopy attached, and then figured I would somehow come up with a way to lift the canopy up with the bucket loader and get it onto the tractor afterwards. So I wrapped the ROPS with an old sheet to protect the paint and wrapped a chain around it to lift it with the bucket loader. Positioning it on the tractor axles was not that difficult. Since it slopes backward, I set it on the axles and then I backed the loader up a bit slowly until it was at the right angle. Then I started installing the bottom plates and the bolts, and I lubed the bolts with a little bit of PB Blaster, which is like WD-40. The manufacturer said it helped the bolts go in easier because the holes had paint in them. When installed, the bolts run right tight to the axle, which means you have to have the ROPS positioned perfectly to install all 8 bolts. Luckily, there's a tab welded on the bottom, a triangular shaped little tab that rests against the back of the axle when you have the ROPS in the right position. And that locates it so that you can get all the bolts on. The bolts take a 1 1/4 inch socket, and I used a 3/4 inch drive ratchet. I snugged the bolts up, then torqued them using the procedure in the instructions, which is kind of complicated. The bolts first get all torqued to 150 foot-pounds, and you follow a pattern like you would if you were tightening a wheel on a car, where you don't tighten them all in a row, but you skip back from side to side. And then after they're all tightened to 150 foot-pounds, then you go back through and tighten them each to 300 foot-pounds, and then you go through a third time and tighten them to 310 foot-pounds. And I had to get out a pipe and put it on the torque wrench to get them that tight. That is tight. Now it was time to deal with the canopy, and what I decided to do in the end was put it on the bucket and angle the bucket up so that I could slide the canopy up past the edge of the bucket. And first I put some old sheets on the bucket to keep from damaging the paint. So I took the canopy on the bucket loader out to the tractor and lifted it up in place, and it took a lot of trial and error, moving the tractor a little bit, raising and lowering the bucket, getting on and off the tractor to see if I had it on at the right angle, and finally, along with some climbing around on the 656 to kind of shove the thing into place, I got it into the right position. A forklift would have been a heck of a lot easier. Then there were about 1,000,000 bolts to install. Well, okay, there were really 22. And I started by installing one bolt in each side, and then I lifted the canopy up with the bucket loader so it was at the right angle to install the rest of the bolts. All the bolts except the through bolts on the crossbar were self-tapping bolts, and they were designed to go into pre-drilled holes in the ROPS and canopy, which made them pretty easy to install. There were a bunch of bolts that needed to be installed from the top of the canopy, so I did that from a ladder. I had some problems with the canopy top bolts. The instructions said they were 5/16, but the holes were too big for that. And some of the holes were too small to get 3/8" self-tapping bolts started. So I drilled out the holes with a 5/16" drill and used the 3/8" self-tapping bolts, and it worked out okay in the end. The ROPS package did come with a seat belt kit, but I'm not going to install it because I just won't use it, and I know Safety Sam's going to have a problem with that, but it's just a fact of life. I won't put on a seat belt when I got to get on and off the tractor all the time. I also got a whole lot of hardware left over, bolts and washers and all kinds of stuff, and I suspect it's because they supply this hardware kit for many models of ROPS, so they just pack the same kit into different models, but it'll have use eventually. I'm really happy with the way that this canopy turned out. It is really well made. I'm really impressed with the construction, and it's certainly miles ahead of my old ROPS and canopy, so I'm grateful that I got it. But it was a bear to put on. I probably had 8 hours into the installation, scattered over 3 days in between other things, and it didn't help that it was so hot out. If I had had a forklift or a gantry crane in a big shop, it would have been a lot easier. It was a lot of hard work. I took this tractor down the road this morning to pick up a load of hay, and I gotta tell you, this canopy is solid. My old canopy would rock back and forth like this whenever I hit a bump in the road. This one didn't move at all. The one thing I will say is it's quite a bit louder than my old canopy, probably because the old canopy was wood and this one's metal, which reflects the sound a lot more. I have heard that putting an extension on the muffler helps cut down on that noise so that the muffler exits above the top of the surface of the canopy. I will say one thing, it makes the rest of the tractor look shabby, right? I got this nice new canopy and no new paint on the tractor. I guess I'm going to have to fix that and paint the tractor. I hope this video was informative. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.